Welcome to the Richard Wagner Society, the Upper Midwest's final event in our conversation series for the year 2021. I'm Michael Rupert. I am the president and the events committee chair for the Wagner Society. And here we are Zooming yet again. Do you all remember just 6 months ago when we thought we'd be virtually rid of this blasted pandemic by now? Well, there's always next year, correct? In the meantime, we all discovered that there are a few terrific benefits in doing virtual sessions such as tonight's. For one, we can feature outstanding guest presenters and performers who may be joining us from virtually anywhere in the world, as is the case tonight with our guest joining us from New York City. For one, we can also feature, we can extend our reach rather to attendees in other parts of the world. Tonight, we are joined by representatives from nearly all of the Wagner societies in the Upper Midwest and North America, including Northern and Southern California, the District of Columbia, New York, Santa Fe, and the Triangle Wagner Society in Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And our farthest flung member of our audience tonight, or in her case, tomorrow morning, is joining us from Australia. So a heartfelt welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. We have a very full, very content-rich program for you tonight. I do expect that we will run over 90 minutes, so please make yourselves comfortable, pour yourself a glass of wine, excuse yourself when you need to, relax, have some coffee. I just saw a glass of wine, Laura, that's wonderful. We'll do our best to field your questions near the end of the session. So if you can please put any questions you have for Stephen in the chat, we'll get to them at the end of his presentation. If you are not able to hang out with us until the conclusion, no fear. We will be making a complete video recording available on our YouTube channel shortly after tonight's presentation, which will include answers to all of the questions, including the meaning of life or any others you ask. Stephen and Jim and I may be the only ones left working on answering questions, depending on how many you ask, but we will guarantee that we will stay until we have gotten through your entire list. So it's our intention that all of your questions will be answered. And again, if you think of questions, just please put them in the chat. Or if you do plan to hang out till the end, you can also ask questions at the end of the session. And now my final bit of housekeeping is the most important, and that is to introduce our very special guest this evening. A Londoner with a degree from the Royal College of Music, Stephen A. Brown studied at the London Opera Centre, then the Young Artists Program for the Covent Garden Opera, before moving on to what was at the time the National Theatre of Great Britain. He later worked for a brief stint at the Metropolitan Opera in New York for 38 years, in fact. First as stage manager responsible for over 70 new productions, revivals, and telecasts, including Wagner's Complete Ring Cycle, before becoming company manager for 20 years and a frequent Met Opera broadcast commentator and quiz panelist. Since retiring in 2017, Stephen has been teaching and lecturing in America and Europe, and he's a regular contributor to Opera Magazine. He's an absolute treasure trove of information about Wagner, and it's been such a delight working with him on this presentation for tonight. So please welcome our guest, Stephen A. Brown.
Michael, thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to this, and it is, like the Meistersinger, going to be a long song. Ich hatte einen wunderschönen Traum. Thus, Walter von Stolzing, the proud young aristocrat from Franconia, the geographical area of the upper part of which Bayreuth was the capital. That is during the first scene of the third act of Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg. But so did Walter's creator also dream. Richard Wagner dreamt of changing music and drama in the German-speaking world and wrote at length about it, at very great length. But despite all of the ink spilt in presenting in writings his dreams on the marriage of poetry and music, far more pointedly, more successfully, more truly himself, although unique in his output, he did so in song. What wondrous dreams are these holding my mind in thrall? The poem continues, dreams that flower with greater beauty with every hour of every day, and blissful intimations of heaven throughout my inner self convey. With Bruno Walter at the piano, you heard Kirsten Flagstad singing the opening of Träume, Dreams, the fifth and last of the poems of Mathilde Wesendonck, and set to music by Richard Wagner, who described this song as one of two studies for Tristan und Isolde. Wagner's dreams were as much about his libido as they were about his towering creativity, his musical talents, which were indeed tremendous. After all, with a single chord, he changed the face of Western music. His dramatic abilities, equally as great as Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles, and certainly theatrical, and his monstrous self-regard. For example, he knew that he was the equal of those Greek playwrights. The musical revolution that he created with the metaphysical world of Tristan und Isolde, desire, yearning, love, even the post-coital little death, are made almost tangible, audible certainly, in a work that owes its existence to a woman 2/3 his age, Mathilde Wesendonck. For Wagner, there appears no difference between making babies and the creation of poetry and music. He wrote to Mathilde of the dream state that he inhabited when composing. And the musician and author Wendelin Weisheimer writes of him saying, "Do not disturb me now, I am in heat." His features completely changed, wild almost. I am in the thick of it, when he was interrupted at the piano whilst creating Die Meistersinger in 1862. Wagner and Mathilde had met in Zurich in 1852. She and her husband Otto, Wagner's contemporary in age, had provided him with a cottage whilst in exile from Dresden following his revolutionary activities there. Wagner became infatuated with Mathilde and wrote a piano sonata for her in 1853. She was his muse, although it is not known whether his feelings were reciprocated or, in fact, physical. However, the offspring of this relationship was Tristan und Isolde, the libretto of which received its first reading in September of 1857 to an audience that included his current wife, Minna, his muse, Mathilde, and his future wife, Cosima. Wagner interrupted the early composition of Tristan to set Frau Wesendonck's poems to music, which demonstrates 2 points about this man: the depth of feeling towards his muse and self-knowledge, knowing just when he was ready, creatively or practically, to take up or continue work on a project. As we shall see, this is very important and possibly a unique element in the development of his later works and his method of composing, that he knew when he ought to proceed with an idea and when to let it ferment. But to return to the more mundane, and Wagner certainly had that side to him, when Minna intercepted a love letter to Mathilde in 1858, the relationship ended. Wagner left his wife and the Wesendonck cottage in order to live in Venice, thus ending the first of the 3 love triangles of his life. However, the work continued, and in 1859, the consequence of this relationship, Tristan, was complete. Tristan und Isolde is, to quote Barry Millington's perfect description in the Wagner Compendium, a dislocation of tonality and extreme chromaticism in line and harmony with its dominant sevenths, and unresolved discords, melodies, and harmonies consistently heightened by chromatic alteration. All devices employed for the generation and intensification of tension, promised but evaded fulfillment, all of which affected the course of musical history. By the early 1860s, Wagner needed a break, and he knew he needed to do something completely different, something new, and not least, something practical, easier for singers to learn and musicians to play. His Nibelungen project had been stuck since 1857, with its dragon-slaying hero, Siegfried, resting in the forest. As the composer's foremost English language biographer, Ernest Newman, states, in the Wagner operas, he turned in horror from a passionate subject like Tristan and Isolde. Dream states are all very well, but they do not put food on the table or pay for, well, anything. On the 30th of October, 1861, he wrote to his publisher, Franz Schott, the grandson of the founder of the music publishing house, that he wanted to write a counter-revolutionary post-Tristan backwards glance to earlier musical and literary styles. A, quote, thoroughly light and popular opera for only modest resources and thus remaining within the reach of smaller houses. With this plan came an updated version of a long and detailed prose sketch for a 3-act comedy about medieval German guilds, master singers of yore, and a singing contest that he had drafted in 1845 whilst on his way to Dresden for the premiere of his latest opera. Also, as it happened, about competitive singing. Tannhäuser was not a success. Certainly not as great as Rienzi had been in 1842 at the then new Gottfried Semper designed opera house in Dresden, where Wagner was the Royal Saxon court conductor, becoming more and more involved in the political unrest brewing throughout Saxony, but now casting about for other subjects for his operas. In 1851, in A Communication to My Friends, Wagner's autobiographical analysis of contemporary culture and his own artistic development, and written in exile in Zurich, he recalled that back in 1845, he had described a comic opera about the Meistersingers as a satire play to follow Tannhäuser, thematically linked by the shared song contests. He also reiterated that, quote, the cheerful mood which sought to vent itself in the conception of Die Meistersinger calls for modest resources. In other words, a light, fast, inexpensive moneymaker. A satire play is a theatrical form of drama written by the Greek tragic playwrights, such as Sophocles for the Theban plays and Aeschylus for in the Oresteia, as the fourth work, a comedy to follow the 3 tragedies, to be performed in a purpose-built theatre at the ancient Greek Dionysia Theatre Festival. During that summer of 1845, after Tannhäuser had been completed, and he was awaiting the October premiere in Dresden, the composer and his wife Minna traveled to Marienbad to take the cure. As he wrote in his autobiography, Mein Leben, dictated in 1866 whilst he was working on Act 2 of Die Meistersinger, quote, the first ideas of what would become Meistersinger date back to Nuremberg itself in July of 1835, where I witnessed a band of partygoers baiting a mentally deficient man who was serenading them in the mistaken belief that he was a great singer. A street fight broke out, which ended as quickly as it had started when the rioters simply melted away, leaving me standing alone in the moonlight of the old city. Whether or not this is true, and there is no substantiating account from Wagner's writings at that time, is open to speculation. Did art imitate life, or life memory imitate art? Instead of resting in Marienbad, in a fit of activity, he reread the epic poem Parsifal by the German Minnesinger, or lyric poet, Wolfram von Eschenbach. The work that 4 years earlier in Paris had provided him with an outline for Lohengrin. He was also reading the 5-volume History of German Poetry, recently completed by Georg Gottfried Gervinus. This included sections on Meistergesang, master songs, and the real-life character of Hans Sachs. In Mein Leben, Wagner continues, I had formed a particularly vivid picture of Hans Sachs and the master singers of Nuremberg. I was especially intrigued by the institution of the marker and his function in rating master songs. I conceived during a walk a comic scene in which the popular artisan poet, by hammering on his cobbler's last, gives the marker, who is obliged by circumstances to sing in his presence, his comeuppance for previous pedantic misdeeds during official singing contests, by inflicting upon him a lesson of his own.
Das Herz will ich bewahren dem Lied, doch halt ist morgen denn nicht Sängerwahl. Ei, sieh doch, sieh, das hätt ich bald vergessen. Was aber soll ich singen? von Manneskraft, ein Lied von Frauenmilde. Was mag am stärksten wohl zum Herz der Hörer dringen? Nun sag's, sag's nun. Schweigt schon der Gott in deiner Brust, verklingen deine Lieder. Was war es denn, das dich zur Poesie gewandt? Der Liebe Glück, das Vaterland, das eure Vaterland.
Conducted by Max Loy with the Franconian Landers Orchestra, you heard the baritone Carl Schmidt-Walter, a famous Bayreuth Beckmesser, singing the aria Wo bist du, Sachs, hat mit ein Traum empfangen. Where are you, Sachs? In the midst of a dream, in the title role of Hans Sachs of the 1840 Singspiel or operetta by Albert Lotzing, who was pictured there. This arioso shares many similarities with the later Flieder monologue that Wagner's Sachs sings in Act 2 of his opera. In fact, this entire work shares much with Wagner's scenario, which is not surprising as Lotzing was related to Wagner's friend, musical assistant, and later revolutionary comrade in Dresden, August Röckel. Based upon a dramatic poem, Hans Sachs, written and premiered in Vienna by Johann Deinhard von Deinhardstein, Lotzing's plot shares many, too many to be coincidental, resemblances to Die Meistersinger, although Wagner himself was in Paris when the opera was performed in Dresden. We do know that he was aware of the poem, not least as a subsequent Berlin revival of the play had an added prologue by no less a cultural icon than Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who had in 1776 written a poem about Hans Sachs. Lotzing was not the first musician to set this plot. In 1833, the 71-year-old Bohemian composer Adalbert Gyrowetz premiered his opera Hans Sachs in Later Life, also in Dresden. Here, the older Hans Sachs helps a younger man win his sweetheart by winning a singing competition. We do not know whether Richard Wagner, becoming court composer in Dresden in 1842, knew of this work, which does involve neither Mastersingers nor guilds. By that time, the Mastersingers guilds for lyric poetry, composition, and unaccompanied art song had been established in Germany and Austria for about 200 years. Developed from an established 12th to 14th century tradition of songwriting and performing by a small group of literary minstrels called Minnesingers. These included three of the characters that Wagner had already placed on stage in Tannhäuser: Wolfram von Eschenbach, Reinmar von Zweter, and of singular importance to the new opera, Walter von der Vogelweide. Reputedly founded in Mainz, members of the Mastersingers Guilds were mainly male, middle-class artisans from the various trades in a number of German cities and towns. Nuremberg, under the leadership of the real Hans Sachs, became its most famous center. Each guild had three classes: Schüler, learners, also called Lehrbubs, corresponding to trade apprentices, Schulfreunde, equivalent to Gesellen or journeyman, and Meister, the poets and singers who could invent a new melody, Weise, tone, or even write new verses to existing ones. A poem was set in the typical AAB pattern known as a bar or a lied, or gazette, a strophe or a stanza, and they were sung unaccompanied. Mastersingers did not compose or perform for any payment. Wagner found all of the details about the Mastersingers from a tome called De Sacri Romani Imperii Liberate Civitate Noribergensi Commentatio, Appendixbuch von der Meistersinger Holdseligen Kunst Altdorf. otherwise known as the Nuremberg Chronicle, by Johann Christian Wagenseil and published in 1697. This chronicle provided not only musical examples of the period, of which Wagner barely chose to avail himself, but also the names of 12 Nuremberg masters, many of whom are characters in the opera, although Wagner did give them a varied selection of trades not listed in the book. By the 16th century, Meistersinger poetry played a large part in the life of any large German town and, rather than the original pure aesthetic of the earlier Minnesingers, came to represent popular art for the middle classes, reinforcing bourgeois, Bürger values. By the 1560s, when the opera is set, poetry was rather a mechanical art form to be learned by study and not through inspiration or creativity. According to Wagenseil, what had started as traditions became rules, which were set down in the so-called tabulatur, or guild regulations. These addressed three different aspects of songwriting. One, the type of poems and the designs of a master song, Meistergesang. Two, permissible rhymes and melodic motives. Three, mistakes to be avoided, including errors of melody, structure, delivery, even opinion, but, and ultimately more important to Wagner's plot, mistakes in rhyme, meter, or choice of words. If you think you cannot remember or even grasp any of this during performance of the opera, then do not fret, for Wagner has Master Fritz Kultner, the pompous baker, explain all in a versification of the regulations as they appear in Wagenseil.
Meistergesanges war, still ordentlich ein Gemesse dar, aus unterschiedlichen Gesetzen, die keiner soll verletzen. Ein Gesetz besteht aus Zwienenstollen, die gleiche Melodie haben sollen. Der Stoll aus etlicher Vers gewählt, der Vers hat seinen Reim am Darauf so folgt der Abgesang, der sei auch etlich Verse lang und hat sein besondere Melodie, als nicht im Stalle zu finden sei. Der Reiche Gesetzeswehre waren, solange die Meister nicht bewahren, und wir ein neues Lied gericht, das lieber mir der Silbe nicht eingreift, in anderer Meister weiß. Es wieder herzlich
That was Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau as Fritz Kultner at Bayreuth in 1956, conducted by André Critons. The photograph showed the names of the Nuremberg masters as listed in Wagenseil's book. And I would like to draw your attention to the last line that Fritz Kultner sang there, "Nun setzt euch in den Singstuhl," in which he asks Walter to sit in the seat of song. We will come to this later on. But let me translate what Mr. Fischer-Dieskau was singing. A master song is in a poetic form known as a bar, strophe, which consists of 3 stanzas, Gesetzen, made up of 2 poetically similar verses, Stollen or Gebänder, and a thematically developed aftersong, an Abgesang. Each verse has 7 lines consisting of 2 rhymed couplets and 3 differently rhymed lines, which share the same or distinctly similar melody in the same key, made up of various representative motives, tenor or Weisen, together with the two strophes. Together, the 2 strophes are called the lead-in song, the Aufgesang. Here is the first verse of what is known as the Morning Dream song in Act 3, Scene 1 of the opera, which perfectly satisfies all of the appropriate rules. It's straightforward rather than sublime. It is a strophic song with harmonic rather than melodic orchestral accompaniment in C major.
Von Blüt und Duft geschwellt die Luft, voll aller Mannen wir sangen, ein Garten lud mich, ein Gast ihm zu sein.
That was Johann Botha pictured with the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra conducted by John Keenan on the 13th of March 2007. In the stanza, the second verse is required by the rules to be a replica of the first in rhyming pattern and melody, as indeed they are in Walter's earlier songs in Act 1. However, here Walter, Wagner, decided on a key change at the end of the stanza. And that was Placido Domingo pictured with the orchestra of the Deutsche Oper conducted by Eugen Jochum. Hans Sachs, Wagner, comments that this modulation, although unusual, is not against the rules. I quote, "You didn't close in the same key. That would offend the masters, but Hans Sachs will learn from it." Almost. More than any other, this opera is about singing and songwriting, and so demonstrates how styles and technique evolve over time, whether we want it to or no. This is a signal, perhaps, that the composer, through his surrogate, Walter, is already thinking of breaking with tradition. As far back as the first act, Sachs has questioned the validity of enforcing traditions that have hardened into rules and suggests that the community can and should be the judge of what is right and proper. Confess the rules right well I know, but every year it might be better to put those rules to a test to find out if, following custom forever, their force and life be still at their best. And if you would be sure, ask folk who don't know the rules of our guild. However, due to Wagner's obvious misreading of the Nuremberg Chronicle, Hans Sachs does not know the rules as well as he thinks he does, confusing a strophe, a bar, with a stanza, a Gesetz. Later in the scene, inspired by a vision made real by the woman appearing before him, there now follows the Abgesang, the after song. 11 lines of 5 rhyming couplets ending with an unrhymed line. This has a different but matching melody in a different key, which then modulates back to the original for the climax. Here is the Abgesang of the first stanza, Gesetz. This example is sung in an English translation. That was John Vickers, pictured and singing in English with the orchestra of the Royal Opera House Covent Garden, with James Pease heard briefly as Hans Sachs and conducted by Raphael Kubelik. After the first strophe, there then follows a second, which follows the exact pattern as the first. This, in turn, is followed by the Abgesang, the poetic summation of the two strophes that came before. It is important that the last line of each of the three after songs should rhyme with each other. Because the 19th century composer felt he needed the same freedom of inspiration that he gives to his tenor avatar, only two of the numerous songs in Die Meistersinger follow precisely the rules as set out by Wagner. One of the perfect bars that Wagner does offer is, on the face of it, surprising, but makes much dramatic sense. It is the serenade that the Nuremberg town clerk and guardian of the rules, Sixtus Beckmesser, sings in Act 2. Both the melody and the poem capture exactly the regulations that rule the Marker and the Meistersinger, even though the poem has a stilted simplicity in language with misplaced accents for Sachs to mark. Some commentators have suggested a melodic similarity to Jewish cantorial style in the trills and frills with which he imitates Kortner's address. However, more pertinent is that the serenade is a parody of an outmoded Italian bel canto aria, and that the coloratura is built upon a direct quote from Walter's earlier introductory song, Am stillen Herd. The implication being that even Beckmesser's craft is infected by the young man. Here is the serenade sung in bel canto style by an Italian master singer in the vocally smooth enunciation of the Italian language.
Umor mi secca di morire, è meglio ambire a giovine amor, perché di tutti i giorni questo più bel mar convien che me la sforni, perché un bambin d'amor promessa per sposa a chi la vincerà il caro suo papà in a piacere venga la bella e dolce vergine la giovine dei miei
You heard Renata Capecchi pictured and singing in Italian with the orchestra of Rai Torino, conducted by Vittorio Gui. Later, of course, Beckmesser tries to manipulate the poem of Walter's prize song to fit into this tune, which then provides the musical basis for the riot that closes the second act. The melody recurs again briefly at the beginning of Act 3, when Sachs asks his apprentice, David, to recite his daily lesson, his Sprichlein. David's ditty is a simplistic refrain with a basic verse pattern A-B, A-B. With 3 verses, it comes across as a childish mini bar. However melodically simple it is, in fact, laid out like a juvenile master song, complete with an aftersong, an Abgesang. It does indeed turn out to be David's own prize song, earning him journeyman status and thus the opportunity to become engaged to Magdalena, because, as Sachs says, and today he also sang his piece well.
Dein Sprüchlein, so sag es ihm.
Ein Sprüchlein, nee, ich kann's gut. Sitz nichts, der Meister ist wohl gemut.
Am Jordan San Johannes stand.
Was? Verzeih das Gewirr, mich machte der Polterabend irr.
Am Jordan San Johannes stand. All Volk der Welt zu taufen. Kam auch ein Weib aus fernem Land, nach Nürnberg war gelaufen. Sein Söhnlein trug zum Uferrand, empfing da Tauf und Namen. Doch als sie dann sich heimgewandt, nach Nürnberg wieder kamen. In deutschem Land gab, als ich fand, dass wir am Ufer des Ornat Johannes war genannt. An der Pegnitz hieß der Hans.
David was here sung by Fryer, with Theo Adam as Hans Sachs in a performance from the Berlin State Opera of the 14th of December 1980, conducted by Ottmar Wagner. A ditty that may well be, but it has deeper dramatic implications. First, the subject matter. On Jordan's banks, St. John did baptize all the people of the world. But, as David notes when he ends the song, in the German part of the world, and I quote the English translation, it soon transpired that the person on the banks of the River Jordan, who was named John, on the banks of Nuremberg's River Pegnitz, was called Hans. It is Sachs' name day. This is a very important personal anniversary throughout Europe. However, here, this charming little song has far greater ramifications before this scene ends. The Hans the Baptist, who officiates by the Pegnitz, will do so again, as he says, a master song has come into being, written and sung by Ritter von Stolzing. The young melody's living father has invited me and Ava to be godparents. And because we have heard the melody, we have come now to its christening. Here, at the beginning of the end, we begin to understand the dramatic architecture of the opera. Whereas David's little spiel, his Sprichlein, pedantically following all of the rules, prepares the audience for the poetic inspiration of the other tenor prize song at the end of the act. The christening of Die selige Morgentraum Deutweiser, the blessed morning dream interpretation melody, harkens back to the end of the beginning of the opera. As the overture closes, the curtain opens and we are in St. Catherine's Church, in the 17th century, the actual headquarters of Nuremberg's Guild of Meistersingers. The congregation is singing a chorale. And what do they sing on Midsummer's Eve? Why, they celebrate the feast of St. John the Baptist, whose birthday it is reputed to have been. When our Saviour came to thee, he willingly accepted baptism that we might be consecrated through christening. What you have just heard was the very first sung music of Richard Wagner performed by the orchestra and chorus at the reopening of the initial post-war Bayreuth Festival in 1951, conducted by Herbert von Karajan. Wagner, typically not wasting any dramatic opportunity, uses the breathing spaces during this chorale to develop musically and dramatically the first tentative interaction of his juvenile leads, throughout which we already hear seeds carried over from the overture of the prize song and the opera's end. But before that can happen, Eva and Walter have some growing up to do, and he has a thing or two to learn about song making, as does the audience. Using the character of David as his mouthpiece, Wagner explains the components of a master song. Expounding upon form, David, full of himself as the only apprentice to the famous Hans Sachs, and already the self-appointed leader of the conservative status quo for the next generation, turns rules into laws and conventions into necessities. But his illustration of the many and varied tones and melodic motives, der Meisterton and Weise, all taken from Wagenseil's list, which you see in front of you, is masterly. He obviously learns his lessons well, which is both good and bad, for he knows the rhyme, but not the reason, what they are, but not what they mean. And unfortunately, more important, how the guild thinks they ought to be used. There is no room for inspiration. Still only an apprentice, we do get the sense that David will never be able to create an original master song himself. That was the magnificently detailed David of Graham Clark with Siegfried Jerusalem at Bayreuth in 1988, conducted by Horst Stein. So just who is David's teacher? Who is the Hans Sachs of history? Born in Nuremberg on the 5th of November 1494, the son of a tailor, he attended a Latin school and studied singing at a local church. Apprenticed to a shoemaker at age 14, by the time he was 17, he was made journeyman, and as such was able to travel with his fellows, working as a shoemaker in several towns and cities of Bavaria, Saxony, and Western Austria. There, he encountered the Emperor Maximilian I, who took him to the imperial court in Innsbruck. After several years working at court, he moved to Munich, where he apprenticed to a linen weaver in order to become a Meistersinger. Settling in Nuremberg in 1516, he was married a few years later and sired 7 children, all of whom died during his lifetime. And when his first wife also died in 1560, he married again. Hans Sachs died in Nuremberg on the 19th of January, 1576, age 81. During his lifetime, he wrote over 6,000 compositions of various kinds, approximately 4,200 master songs, which were not published, being intended only for the Nuremberg master singing school, of which he was the leading light. He also wrote other songs and poems, stories, carnival plays, and, somewhat surprisingly perhaps, religious tracts. He was a huge proponent of the Reformation and an ardent supporter of the new German version of the Bible. To honor its translator, Martin Luther, he wrote a poem in 1523 when aged 29, whose opening line is "The nightingale of Wittenberg, which is heard everywhere. Das Wittenbergische Nachtigall, die man jetzt höret überall." In Act 3, Scene 2 of the opera, Wagner has the Nuremberger townsfolk address Sachs in the words of that poem, but with an original melody, comparing Hans Sachs with Martin Luther. Awake, the dawn is drawing near. I hear singing in the green grove a blissful nightingale. Wacht auf, es naht gegen den Tag, ich hör singen im grünen Hag ein wonniglicher Nachtigall. Again, it is the architecture of the opera that is important here, as Wagner both opens and closes the opera with the chorus singing the praises of John, Hans, Baptist and poet. The chorus and orchestra of the Metropolitan Opera, conducted by James Levine on the 8th of December 2001. Just how does this intricately plotted and composed opera compare with the detailed, light-hearted, long, 3-act prose sketch that Wagner created in what he later referred to as a highly feverish state on the 16th of July, 1845? Was this still a comic companion piece to the moral and spiritual story of a singing contest that was Tannhäuser? In that first extensive scenario, the dramaturgy of the final work is recognizable. But whereas the soprano in this sketch is typical of the light operas of the period and the tenor more entitled and self-pitying than self-confident, The text opens with a stereotypical duet of young lovers rather than the tentative probing conversation that interrupts the opening chorale, as we heard earlier. Only the character of Hans Sachs is named, and he comes across as a more cynical and calculating than does his later self. Wagner is more concerned about the as yet unnamed marker and the dramatic necessity of how he obtains the prize song. These characters have much more personal antipathy than their later selves, and the old-fashioned aria that will become the Act 3 Wahn soliloquy is a commentary on the nature and decline of German art and poetry. Nevertheless, the end of this prose sketch does have an afterthought in which Wagner quotes Friedrich Schiller from half a century earlier. While the political empire totters, the spiritual empire has become increasingly secure and more perfect, which Wagner in 1845 renders as, though the Holy Roman Empire dissolve in mist, yet for us will holy German art persist. I can do no better than quote the blog of the renowned author and music critic of the New Yorker magazine, Alex Ross. From the outset, Hans Sachs was slated to play a mediating role, supporting the young poet while directing him with wisdom of experience. Ross continues, when Wagner first sketched out the scenario, he was the Kapellmeister in Dresden, and chafing against the conservatism of the Saxon court and of the wider musical community, Meistersinger is essentially an allegory for Wagner's own struggles as a gifted, headstrong young singer-poet contending with the rule-bound small-mindedness of the local Master Singers Guild. At the age of 32, Wagner saw himself as the hero, the typical tenor ready to take on the world, fight dragons and baritones, win, lose, and then carry away his soprano. This was to change, as Ernest Newman points out. He came to realize quite quickly that the initial sketch was not right, that the hero of the work should be Sachs. As I noted at the outset, one of the most interesting things about Richard Wagner is his self-knowledge as a composer and dramatist. He was fully aware of when to write, but also when not to write. Despite his arrogance and self-conceit, he knew when he was not ready to develop a concept, and just when he was finally fully prepared to create something that was profoundly meaningful and magnificent. But reality bites. As Alex Ross commented earlier, life in Dresden was becoming incendiary following the uprisings across Germany in favor of a national assembly and a constitutional monarchy under the Prussian king. In May of 1849, Dresden rose against its Saxon king, Frederick August II, and Richard Wagner, the royal Saxon court conductor, wrote inflammatory newspaper articles inciting the revolt and was probably even involved in the fighting. The Prussian king refused the national crown and sent troops to help the Saxon king quell the rioters, the leaders of which were captured, tried, and imprisoned. Wagner escaped, and because he was now a wanted man in Germany, fled to Switzerland, leaving his wife Minna in Dresden. Once in Zurich and banished from his homeland, the theatres and the concert halls, he was forced to prepare the premiere of Lohengrin from afar, to be conducted in Weimar by no less an international musical icon than Franz Liszt. It was at this time that he first met and became friendly with Otto Wesendonck and his wife Matilda, on both of whom he would have such a profound effect as they had on him. Otto financially supported the destitute composer and, as noted, Matilda provided, well, let's call it emotional support. We are back where we started, with the tale of Richard Wagner, his muse Matilda, and his dreams. Particularly his dreams for the future of German music and German poetry, and that magical combination of the two, German opera. Having been criminalized and exiled because of his German journalism in Dresden, Wagner now turned his hand to writing essays, which were to create even greater waves and still reverberate some 170 years later. In an 1840 novella, A Pilgrimage to Beethoven, Wagner had fictionally described a lyric drama where traditional operatic divisions would no longer exist. This idea was to expand into two written compositions, Art and Revolution, written in Paris in 1849, in which he explains the ideal artwork for an ideal society, and the artwork of the future, written in Zurich also in 1849, postulating his ideas for the ideal music drama. These works were amalgamated and further extended in the book-length treatise Opera and Drama, written in Zurich in 1850, a serious attack on contemporary opera, especially Rossini and Meyerbeer, both of whom he had met in France and asked for professional help as well as money. In the book, this diatribe against effect without cause was followed by a discussion of the importance of poetry in an ideal music drama, and a final section that contemplates just what such an ideal might be. It was also during this time that he wrote the infamous essay Judaism in Music, written in Zurich in 1850 and published anonymously in Leipzig in 1851. Also during this time, Das Rheingold was being completed by 1854, together with what is probably the most practical, serious example of Wagner's theatrical theories, Die Walküre, completed in 1856. And composition was beginning on the music of Siegfried. However, Wagner's thoughts were being directed more and more elsewhere, with the notion of ideal love, prompted by Mathilde Wesendonck, as portrayed in the lives and longings of the ultimate medieval chivalric tale, the Middle High German courtly romance Tristan und Isolde by Gottfried von Strassburg, who died in the year 1210. It was also at this time that Wagner discovered the writings of the Polish-born philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. He contended the notion of art as a means of escape from the subjective sufferings of the world, and that music is the most objective of the arts because it does not represent the world in which it is heard, yet capable of communicating emotion. This was enough for Wagner to seriously reevaluate his own ideas about opera, poetry, and music drama at exactly the same moment that instinctively he was becoming aware that his Siegfried was not sufficiently developed musically or orchestrally to climb the mountain and awaken a sleeping Valkyrie. As he later said, his reading put him in a, quote, serious mood created by Schopenhauer, which was trying to find ecstatic expression. It was some such mood that inspired the conception of a Tristan und Isolde. As a result, young Siegfried was left in the forest listening to the birdsong, where he was to rest for 11 years. Yet Richard could not rest. Although he used the time to hone his craft with Tristan und Isolde and Meistersinger, he made his by now typical error of putting pen to paper, and yet again, in the midst of creating a musical revolution, allowed his writing to run riot. In 1857, a schism developed between Wagner and Franz Liszt over the precise meaning of the term the music of the future, Zukunftsmusik. This was a pejorative description in a collection of 1852 essays referring to the music of these two composers, given by Clara Schumann's father, the music teacher and writer Friedrich Wieck. In simple terms, Liszt believed that uniting poetry and music meant programmatic symphonic works, such as those of the French composer Hector Berlioz. And for many of his own compositions, he did write lengthy introductions. Wagner's belief was in uniting all of the artistic disciplines in staged music dramas. Over the ensuing few years, the two sparred to the point of physical violence over the dispute. Wagner held that purely symphonic music, even with programs attached by their composers, simply could not be considered music of the future. Quote, "The poet is measured by what he leaves unsaid, letting us breathe in silence what is unspeakable," he said. The musician brings his untold mystery to clarion voice, and the perfect form of his allowing silence to sound, his endless melody. This was written soon after the completion of Tristan und Isolde, which was also at the forefront of his mind when writing his own essay entitled The Music of the Future, even though the score was sitting unperformed in his drawer, along with those of Das Rheingold, Die Walküre, and the first two acts of Siegfried. The one positive note during this time was that Wagner was at last in Vienna able to see and hear a performance of Lohengrin in the theatre. But even this did not compensate for the fiasco over the dramatic placement of the Venusberg Ballet in Act 1 instead of Act 2 of the revised Tannhäuser in Paris in 1861. With the music of the future in abeyance, Wagner turned to the past. In Mein Leben, he tells that in November 1861, whilst on an excursion to the Basilica di Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari, whilst visiting the Wiesendogs in Venice, he was reminded of the world of the Meistersingers when viewing the larger-than-life-size altarpiece, The Assumption of the Virgin, in which only the center figure is by Titian. By that time, he was psychologically and emotionally all too willing to switch his musings from the provocative muse of one singing contest, the reviled Venus, to the ingenuous muse of another, sweet little Asian. In a happy stroke of fate, it was at just this time that Wagner's friend, the composer Peter Cornelius, found a copy of Wagenseil's Nuremberg Chronicle in Vienna and gave it to him. Despite the medieval flavor and accurate details of Wagenseil's book, what Wagner created from his first prose sketch of 1845 was an idealized paternalistic view of a musicians' guild which appears as a major force in a sentimentalized community where singing and dancing is a norm, people work hard, and everyone appreciates art and culture. It does sound a bit like a Broadway show. In reality, nothing could be further from the truth, except perhaps the paternalism. The guilds were closed societies, and with regards to the Meistersingers, their manuscript works were performed only for each other and not even printed for the general populace to enjoy. However, within the rose-colored romanticism surrounding Wagner's Nuremberg of the second prose sketch, we find that his reading of Schopenhauer had triggered a change from the simple love story to a glorious affirmation of humanity and the value of art. Wagner refocused the scenario of his inexpensive comic opera to address the place of music in society, the renunciation of human will, in German Wille, and to demonstrate the comfort that music can bring to a world of self-deception and folly, Wahn. It is Wahn which causes the Act II riot arising from a case of mistaken identity, which is seen as a form of self-delusion. The critic and Wagner scholar Lucy Beckett notes the remarkable similarity between Hans Sachs as presented by Wagner and Schopenhauer's description of the noble man. We always picture a very noble character as having a certain trace of silent sadness resulting from knowledge of the vanity of all achievements and the suffering of all life, not merely one's own. Schopenhauer in the world as will and representation. In the new scenario, the jovial poetic hero that is now Hans Sachs is joined by David and Magdalena. Ava is still not named, being known only as the daughter or the maiden, and later Emma. And the young man is called just that. Although he later briefly becomes Conrad, Beckmesser is simply der Merker, the marker, later Veit Hanslick, a Wagnerian stab at the author's nemesis, the Viennese critic Eduard Hanslick. At this point, Wagner was still stressing the simplicity and practicality of the new work, and in the 1861 letter noted earlier to his publisher Franz Schott, he writes of the new, fun, light, and easily staged opera will need neither a so-called first tenor nor a great tragic soprano, and that the leading role of Hans Sachs will be written in a convenient bass register so that it could be sung in any theatre by the best of baritones or even deep basses. What began as a comic appendage to Tannhäuser had become a counter-revolutionary antidote to Tristan and Isolde, dramatically, theatrically, and musically. Schott liked the idea and gave it his seal of approval, and on the 19th of November 1861, Wagner sent him a third prose sketch, somewhat similar to the earlier second sketch, except for some minor changes in the second act. Although Parsifal deliberately refers back to Lohengrin, it had to, the characters are related. In Wagner's mind at the time of this Meistersinger, this Meistersinger still referred back beyond Tannhäuser to the stage works of Weber, Marschner, and Lortzing. In fact, by looking backwards and utilizing the old forms to emphasize character and plot delineation and development, Wagner did not yet understand that he was pushing forward to the art form of the future, as he termed it. continuing the revolution that exploded Europe's cultural, musical, and theatrical scene with Tristan and Isolde. Wagner began writing the libretto of Die Meistersinger in Paris in early 1862, and by that April had composed the overture, which he conducted at its premiere in Leipzig on the 2nd of November 1862. Before a note of the opera itself had been written, he needed the cash and the advertising. The composition of the first act began in the spring of 1863 in Vienna. Already, the new opera was outgrowing its creator's stated intentions given the forces involved. Whereas, for his previous works, he had written out his short score on 3 staffs, vocal line, orchestral line, and proposed orchestration, for Meistersinger he needed 4 and sometimes even 5 staffs. He then created the full scores for each act only after he had completed them in short score. Even as he was writing the opera, circumstances in Wagner's life were changing. By 1863, he was 50, homeless, wifeless, post-Lohengrin, post-Tristan, post-Matilda, and deeply involved in the second of his 3 love triangles. This was with Cosima Liszt von Bülow, the daughter of Franz Liszt and wife of the pianist, conductor, and writer Hans von Bülow. Despite this, these years for Wagner were going from bad to worse. He started to give up hope that The Ring would ever be completed. The scheduled Vienna premiere of Tristan and Isolde in 1864 was abandoned after 77 rehearsals, and a Viennese creditor drove him out of Austria. Then, because he was late in delivering Meistersinger as planned, Franz Schott refused to pay any further advances on the opera. He was so hard up financially that he had to tour as a conductor for hire, Prague, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Budapest, Vienna, and other less major cities throughout Germany. It was whilst he was conducting in Stuttgart in 1864 that everything changed. News reached Wagner that the new King of Bavaria, the 19-year-old Ludwig II, was a great supporter of his work and now wished to appoint him court composer, pay off all of his debts, and create in Munich a new music school, and a new theatre for Wagner to develop and control. On the 4th of May 1864, the composer met his new patron in an unprecedented 90-minute audience in Munich, and the Swan King, so called because of his fixation on Lohengrin, met his idol. Of this meeting, Wagner wrote, "Alas, he is so handsome and wise, soulful and lovely, that I fear that his life must melt away in this vulgar world like a fleeting dream of the god." However, while it lasted, he fully intended to make the most of this new relationship, the third and final love triangle of his life between himself, Ludwig II, and the nanny state of the Bavarian government. The depth of the relationship was demonstrated in January of 1867, when Wagner was the first person that Ludwig told he was engaged to his cousin, Princess Sophia in Bavaria, the sister of the Empress Elizabeth of Austria, in a telegram that said, and I quote, "Walter informs his dear Sachs that he has found his faithful Eva." Although life was starting to look up in January of 1866, Wagner's first wife, Minna, died in Dresden. She and Richard had not seen each other since 1862, although they were never divorced. Wagner and Cosima von Bülow were, by then, finally recognized as a couple, even though he continued to support Minna financially throughout her life. And just 6 weeks after Minna's death, he moved into the Villa Tribschen, just outside of Lucerne, Switzerland. Here, Cosima visited intermittently between 1866 and 1868, although she always returned to Munich to her husband in order to preserve propriety and the patronage of the king. Hans von Bülow was very well aware of the relationship, writing to a friend, "Since February of 1865, I was in absolutely no doubt about the extremely peculiar nature of the situation." Cosima finally left her husband permanently in November of 1868 to take up residence in Tribschen. Much later, she was to write about the difficult years of the birth of the comic opera. When future generations seek refreshment in this unique work, may they spare a thought for the tears from which the smiles arose. In February of 1867, almost exactly 1 year after Minna's death, Wagner's second daughter by Cosima was born. She was named Eva. And just 9 months later, on the 24th of October, 1867, Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg was finally completed. A few weeks ago, when I started work on this lecture, a close friend and former colleague of 40 years, whose favorite opera Die Meistersinger is, commented that this opera is about the only character of any Wagnerian work that one could meet walking down the street. With the possible exception of the pseudo-Shakespearean principles of Das Liebesverbot, is a valid point. You do not take a country walk expecting to meet a family of pharaohs from a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta in a field. Oh yes, indeedy, 50 years before the British satirist, the 20-year-old Wagner created his own half-fairy in Die Feen. Or a teenage tenor in a Spanish forest killing a bird with a bow and arrow, let alone a real Roman tribune swanning down the river Tiber like a legendary silver knight in the Netherlands. Or even these days, Venus in blue jeans, some 60 years after pop fame. Well, one might, both on Broadway and London's West End recently bestowed us with a highly successful Venus in furs. And perhaps one can these days meet a pair of giants in the construction business or sail on a ship with a skeleton crew, who knows? But the Western world is absolutely teeming with pedantic city clerks, cheeky, ill-informed apprentices fighting over their girlfriends, and love-struck ingenues swiping right any aristocratic entitled hunks who look good in pictures as they battle bullies, or desperately seeking middle-aged uncles to help them escape fathers who want to sell them to their cronies. One should note that the first real words spoken by Hans Sachs in the opera are, "Many a man would gladly give up his wife." How much more real can you get? In the opera's Act 2 scene with Eva, Sachs refers to himself as a widower with children who had died, and she offers herself for the job. This whole act is a Midsummer Night's Dream that takes place through the late hours of St. John's Eve, the 23rd, 24th of June. Given the life of the real man, therefore, the drama can be quite precisely dated to the years 1560 or 1561, when he was between marriages. The historical Hans Sachs would have been 67 or 66 years old. Indeed, a wise older man, even though these days he is generally not played as aged, who has seen all there is to see in human behavior. Unlike every other principal character, he is there to aid, to teach, to explain. At no point is he self-serving, but represents always the greater good, a common weal. It is almost as unlike Richard Wagner, the man, as one can get. When Sachs first hears of Pogner's plan to market his daughter to a companionable master singer in the competition, Sachs immediately empathizes with Eva and objects, pointing out a maiden's heart, Mädchenherz, and a master's art, Meisterkunst, do not always glow with equal ardor. This is an unpopular stance with his burgher brethren, especially the overzealous Marker, the anticipated winner. When Kortner remarks that obviously any candidate must be a bachelor, Beckmesser dryly suggests perhaps a widower too. Just ask Sachs, who slaps him down immediately by responding that they are both too old. Oh no, the wooer must be of younger wax than you and me. And he goes on to tell the assembled masters that if you wish to show the people how highly you honor art, if you let the girl choose for herself and do not want her to oppose the verdict, then let the people be judges too, and they will assuredly agree with her, not you. I'm quoting from the libretto here. As a successful businessman, Eva's father certainly understands the optics and agrees, even if Beckmesser does not wish to do so. Although neither Hans Sachs nor we are aware of it at the time, the situation changes when he first becomes consciously aware of the Ritter von Stolze. Whatever his personal democratic distaste against the snobbish aristocrat with competition experience, expecting special treatment because of his connection, Sachs sees only the inspiration of a youthful artist more than the entitlement of name, rank, and ancient class. Sachs is the only master to recognize publicly that if the masters had really known their own rules and were not tied up in their pettifogging politics and personal jealousies, the opera would be considerably shorter. In response to Kortner's demand of Walter, which master's pupil are you? Sachs, like Wagner, recognizes the value of looking backwards to see a future, and that Walter von Stolzing's long since dead namesake and teacher, Walter von der Vogelweide, provides a strong basis upon which to build a technique. Von Stolzing's response to Kortner's question is, of itself, a perfect improvisation of great poetic dexterity that conforms to every one of Wagenseil's rules of rhyme, rhythm, motives, and melodies. It starts out with a well-crafted narrative requirement that quickly develops into a superb artistic outpouring worthy of any great singer. An important point is that he is trying to communicate with his audience, here the assembled masters who are already judging him. The correct meter of the first stanza of the strophe having perfect rhyming pattern, Winterzeit, eingeschneit, lacht, erwacht, vermacht, lesen, gewesen, with a single penultimate unrhymed line naming his teacher, Herr Walter von der Vogelweide. Before the second stanza comes an interruption by the other characters on stage. Here, Beckmesser sneers and Kortner has continued questioning. These disruptions are certainly not in the rules governing a master song, but a technique that Wagner uses throughout to give dramatic necessity to an aria that might, in other circumstances, seem to hold up the action of the plot. In many ways, they function like recitatives between the cavatina, stretta, and cabaletta of the earlier Italian operas. The second stanza is in the same key and rhyming pattern, the single unrhymed penultimate line now repeating the exact same word from the first stanza, Vogelweide, but now playing on the actual meaning of the word, that he learned to sing by hearing the songs of the birds in the fields. This stanza is further interrupted by the masters, who are discomfited by what they hear, causing Kortner to ask whether you have ever succeeded in creating a master song, new in invention, both poem and melody, of your own composition. Well, yes, he has, precisely, right then and there, if they would but listen. For then comes the most perfect Abgesang, longer than the stanzas and with a different, more complex rhyming pattern, including repetition, alliteration, assonance, internal rhymes, as in, for example, these first 7 lines. Was Winternacht, was Walde spracht, was Buch und Haine mich wiesen, was dichte Sanges Wunder macht, mir heimlich wollte schließen, was Rosse Schritt beim Waffenritt, was Reihentanz bei heiterem Schanz mir sinnend gab zu lauschen, which 2 lines later rhymes with einzutauschen. And the young lad has not yet even had a trial, which, when it comes, is almost, not quite, as correct. For inspiration usurps tradition as Wagner, the revolutionary, in the guise of our young protagonist, fights the conservative values and ideas of the world around him. Wagner's experience at the Singschule, which is what this proceeding is, follows exactly Wagenseil's description of such a trial following a church service, except he describes 4 markers, each with a specific task to adjudicate, whereas it suited Wagner's dramatic purpose to have only 1 marker, to highlight and contrast the rivalry between Walter and the bourgeois community that he is trying to impress. Also, providing an effective antagonist to drive the plot by underlining character flaws is valuable dramaturgy, especially as there is more than a hint of class warfare here. The proud Junker Walter presenting himself as the natural successor to the patron of the Master Singers Guild, King David, as warrior and singer. However, something that is frequently overlooked but vitally important is that Beckmesser's chalk scratches interrupting the creative flow are spot on. He is correctly marking flaws in the song that Walter is improvising, which must have been a deliberate part on Wagner's side, if only to highlight the pedantry of the moment. It is here that we first encounter the darker side of Die Meistersinger, in the character and condemnation of Beckmesser in his capacity as marker and as a human being. We are brought face to face with Wagner's ideological crusade to revive the, quote, German spirit and purge it of, quote, alien elements, which at this time meant primarily Judaism, as laid out in his infamous essay, Judaism in Music. It must be pointed out, however, that Wagner did not create the characteristics in the personality of Sixtus Beckmesser. He developed them from the source material of Johann Ludwig Deinhardt, and much more so from the musical setting by Albert Lortzing in his 1840 Singspiel, from which it is very easy to list all of the parallels between the character of Eoban Hesse and his Wagnerian coeval. Nevertheless, Beckmesser is indeed a parody, socially inept with an ability to match words and music. But Wagner, directly by creating this character and indirectly through the machinations and commentary of Hans Sachs, is not completely honest. We must never forget that Beckmesser is the town clerk of Nuremberg, therefore very clever, smart perhaps. He is a Meistersinger and therefore must have some talent. As I noted earlier, his serenade is sensible, it's simple. It may be inappropriate in that it presents his feelings and not those of the young maiden he is wooing. And he may very well be much more interested in her goldsmith father's dowry than in the girl. And thus, he is right in being concerned and jealous of rivals to her hand and fortune, be they wise, elderly, and avuncular, or gifted, young, and inspirational. This does not preclude the fact that his serenade does fit all the rules, with the right melodic tones, even if it does not speak to a young girl's love. Of course, he does come a cropper when he tries to fit the lyrics of Walter's Morning Dream Song to his melody. What he achieves is gibberish, unfairly making him a social outcast. However, all is not bad with Beckmesser. His hunting call, Fang it an, provides the inspiration for the trial song. Again, a dramatic narrative necessity that defines character and provides impetus to the plot. There is a fundamental difference between this trial song and Walter's first outpouring, Am stillen Herd. Here, the singer is forcibly controlled, made physical and visual by the requirement that he must sit in the Singstuhl, as he was told by Kortner earlier, which must seem a cross between a throne and the rack. As a result, he is not singing to an audience on stage or in-house, as he starts by ruminating to himself, tempering inspiration with form, as he is now aware of rules that he does not yet understand. The orchestra emphasizes this in a swirling commentary over a simple bass line, quite reminiscent of Tristan. This song, again, is in bass form, but with the mistakes already noted for the marker to catch. Only the first two stanzas are heard clearly. Following a first stanza about spring, a series of scratchings having been heard from the unseen marker slate, Walter sings of the envious winter, Beckmesser, lying in wait in the thorn bush. Walter describes the marker as Grimmbewehr, a play on words meaning both guarded with anger, but also authenticated by Grimm, from the story by the brothers Grimm called The Jew in the Thorn Bush, Das Jude im Dorn. Wagner's private joke? This leads to a heated public debate following the second stanza on the aesthetics of free melody and chromatic music. Regardless of what they all sing, this is about fear and jealousy on one side, arrogance and disparagement on the other. Class warfare on both sides. Lost in the complicated ensemble of offended masters. Who calls that singing? And I understand nothing. Even he jumped up from the chair. The Abgesang is sung by an angry, disappointed young nobleman with no sense of propriety, standing on the Singstuhl and looking down on the world, in many ways still as narrow-minded as the pedants he now despises. Walter and Beckmesser detest each other. Lights, cameras, action. The town clerk's resentment is evident even from his very first appearance. During his opening conversation with Wagner, the goldsmith, he is concerned about the conditions applying to the competition in which Ava is the prize, although Wagner promises to support his colleague's candidacy should he win. His jealousy is soon given face and form as Wagner, a well-travelled merchant who is upset by the complete disregard of honest, hard-working middle-class tradesmen by the blue-blooded upper echelons of society across the German states. And he is heartened by the prospect of not just an outsider, but an aristocrat wishing to join the Masters' Guild, a little suspecting his motives. Beckmesser does, and is really disturbed, believing that Ava should have no choice in the matter because, as he said, if only a woman understood better, but worthless bragging counts for more with them and all poetry. He betrays his unease further when Wagner refers Walter to the masters as candidate material, calling him an upstart knightly weed. Sachs castigates him. Whether lord or peasant does not matter here. It is only a question of art. The stage is now set for Beckmesser to obliterate the opposition at his trial. Although Ernest Newman states in his biography of the composer that only Tristan can be compared with Meistersinger for intensity and continuousness of inspiration, he points out that this is not a dissertation upon the relative merits of conservatism and radicalism in music. It may not have meant to have been, but it is. The liberal, tolerant attitude shown by Hans Sachs, both in the Singschule, I found it new but not confused. If he left our paths, he at least strode firmly and surely. But more important, during the Act 2 Flieder monologue, when meditating upon the entire episode and all that it betokened, creatively, inspirationally, educationally, generationally, it sounds so old, yet seems so new. He contemplates the young aristocrat's compulsion to sing, seeking an explanation for such unique inspiration, yet without study. He sang as he must, and as he must, so he could. Walter's audition is a foregone conclusion. He frightens the master, and they retreated behind their close-minded conservative traditions. Yet Sachs is pleased by that. Walter will need his tutelage in Act 3 to understand focused, controlled inspiration. And what an inspiration he has in the daughter of the house in which he is staying, but with whom he had no chance to converse due to the propriety, despite, or perhaps because of being a proud, young, entitled aristocrat, and, although he has strong emotional feelings, is just as proper in his own way as the masters are in theirs. Ifchen is not a child. She is Ava. She is Mathilde Wesendonck, bourgeois, educated, with an interest in the visual arts, and yet she is also Cosima Liszt von Bülow, a decade younger than Mathilde, cultured, aristocratic, with good connections and intensely attracted to musical genius. Seeing the young man in her home, she has taken quite a fancy, and when he follows her to church and approaches her to ask if she is taken, betrothed, her response to Walter, "You or no one," scares her companion Magdalena, who thinks she has lost her mind over a man she met for the first time the day earlier. When Ava says that she has seen him before in pictures, Magdalena assumes that she means the king with the harp and the long beard on the master's coat of arms. Ava corrects her by describing the young lad whose pebble-felled Goliath, with his sword in his belt, his sling in his hand, his fair hair shining, a painting by the Nuremberg artist Albrecht Dürer Jr. It should be noted, perhaps, that his father of the same name was also a well-known painter and a goldsmith. Wagner's model for Veit Wagner.
Meistersinger,
seid ihr das nicht?
der Bergesang,
Poetgericht,
der Preisgericht,
und wie die Meister meinen,
die Brauttabelle,
und kein Versehen, nicht und sehen, lass mich den Ritter gewinnen, so sie noch gehst und zum ersten Mal, hast du den Schmuck schnell getan, dass ich ein Lach in die Wege sah.
That was Rosa Nordmo-Löfberg, Sebastian Meistersinger, and Regina Resnick with the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, conducted by Karl Böhm, on the 7th of March, 1959. Emotionally, dramatically, and musically, the next meeting of Eva and Walter in Act 2 is altogether different. They have both matured as a result of the first act. She knows that he tried to win her and failed. He knows that he has made an enemy in this contest. They both believe that their burgeoning love is doomed, but they know, as did Tristan and Isolde, that they are destined for each other. And Wagner gives their music in the same strain, so very different from the first act, containing the same clang, as the Germans say, sound of the earlier opera. That was Renee Fleming and Peter Seifert as Eva and Walter in Bayreuth in 1996, conducted by Daniel Barenboim. The music of the future is in full blossom when sung, as there, by a young Tristan. In her own way, Eva is a strong-willed young lady and knows her way around, as we would say these days, and Wagner paints her thus in musical passages such as that, and she will have her own Isolde moment before the opera is over. But before she can become a woman, she behaves as any other infatuated teenage girl in every Italian comic opera. She attempts to manipulate by flirting with an old family friend who carried her in his arms when she was a baby to obtain information. But in playing him, she also goes as far as to echo Beckmesser by suggesting that Sachs enter the competition in order to win and marry her himself. Sachs tells her that he is too old, and she retorts with a variation of his own feelings from earlier, that age is not important, art is, and understanding. She questions just who he now carries in his heart, and misunderstanding his response, dredges up his painful past, surrounded by death in his family. In order to push her own agenda, she offers to become his wife and child. But in playing him, she does go too far, and Sachs is wise enough to make it appear a joke. But the music tells us that he understands his true feelings for her and the simple choice that lies before him. Take her or guide her onto the true path. To which end he belittles Walter in order to make her betray herself so that he can understand the depth of her feelings and then fix the problem. Eva's naivety is at once astonishing, yet rather sweet, but it does place Sachs in a difficult position. And if you did not know that Renee Fleming ever sang Wagner or in Die Meistersinger, here in a rare recording of a radio broadcast in Hamburg in 1953, conducted by Herbert Sandby, is Sigurd Björling as Hans Sachs, with the Eva of Birgit Nilsson.
Hofft ich sicher zu ersingen,
Wieso denn dir?
ein Junggesell, es gibt deren wenig dort so still.
Könnt's einem Witwer nicht genügen?
Ein Kind, der wär so alt für dich.
Was zu alt? Hier gilt der Kunst, der sie versteht, der Verb und mich.
Die Äffchen, mach's mir blauen Dunst.
Nicht ich, ihr seid ihr, macht mir Flausen, ich steh nur
weiter frei. Ja, ja, das hast du nicht schön erdacht.
Ich glaub, der Meister mich gar verlacht.
For those of you who are wondering, you are looking at a picture of Sigurd Björling, Birgit Nielsen, together with Seth Svanholm in a photograph from Die Walküre in Stockholm in 1956. I couldn't find one of them singing in Die Meistersinger, not surprisingly. Eva does not discover much from Sachs and flounces away from him in anger, but from her he understands much about himself. Later, after hearing of Walter's defeat at the hands of the marker from her rejected suitor, they are twice stopped from eloping. First, by the arrival of Beckmesser himself, come to serenade at her window, and then by Sachs, who throws lantern light across the escape route and sings his warning to the lovers hiding under the cloak of darkness. You upon whom love's dream smiles, heed the voice of one keeping watch by night, foreseeing calamity, prudently urging you to beware. No, that is not what Sachs sings, but it fits the situation perfectly. That is how Brangäne warns the lovers Tristan and Isolde in a marvelous musical passage, almost a vocalise that makes one forget the very words that she sings. Einsam wachend in der Nacht, wem der Traum der Liebe lacht, hab der einen Ruf in Acht. Honest to the style of this opera, however, Sachs sings his warning in an old cobbler's song with seemingly improvised words on a biblical subject, of course in perfect bar form. What makes the song interesting is twofold. The fact that everything Sachs sings, ostensibly religious, has a double meaning for each of the lovers. When Eva was driven from paradise by God, the hard gravel caused pain to her bare foot, and Adam bangs his toe against the stones so that in future he can walk properly. Then, just as with almost all bar songs throughout, there are interruptions between the first two strophes and the Eingesang. Eva and Walter both realize that Sachs is talking about them. The second strophe continues in a similar vein, with Sachs bewailing his need to work late because of the behavior of Adam and his Eve. And when Walter wonders on whom Sachs is playing such tricks, Beckmesser, Eva, or himself, she understands that not only is it intended for all three of them, but that she is now aware that his song lays bare the cobbler's own feelings about his life and about her, and this saddens her. This is especially true of the Abgesang, the aftersong. O Eva, hear my lament. The works of art of a cobbler creates the world, treads underfoot. If an angel were to call me to paradise, how gladly I would leave shoes behind. Although this sequence is great fun, dramatically and musically in the theatre, this moment is ineffably poignant for all four characters on stage. After the dress rehearsal for the premiere in 1868, Wagner wrote to Ludwig II, who had been present, that he hoped that the king would perceive under the popular humour that played on the surface of the work the profound melancholy, the lamentation, the cry of distress of poetry in chains, and its reincarnation, its new birth. Schopenhauer, who had died in 1860, might have been very pleased. Wagner is not simply speaking in abstracts. He is orchestrating the sorrows of the human condition while making us laugh. Not just orchestrating, but creating thoughts and emotions with and in pure music, often without the needs for words, as in the examples of Brangäne's Call, warning the dreaming lovers of the realities of life. In January 1993, the New York Times music critic, Edward Rothstein, reviewing the then new production of Die Meistersinger at the Metropolitan Opera, said, just as Sachs teaches Walter, it constructs art out of dream. Then, by using rules of form as rigorous as those of the Meistersingers, all regulation seems to dissolve into expression. Art returns to the realm of dream. When, at the end of Act 3, Scene 1, with the arrival on the scene of his muse, Eva, the vision of Walter's incomplete dream from earlier in the scene is now concrete and complete, if not quite yet, art. a happier outcome than that to Brangena's call. Here, the young people do listen to their elders. And I think that is the point. The mature metaphysical yearning of Tristan and Isolde is substantially different from the youthful desires of Walter and Eva. And there is a definite sexual innuendo during Eva's second visit to Saxe on the morning of the contest, where they are both talking about how the shoe fits, where it hurts, and how it ought to fit.
Ist nicht so gefährlich und ist dem Schneiden geglückt, wer sieht da, was mir beschwerlich, wo still der Scham mich nicht.
Wer bist du schon? Es hat eine Laune, dass du ihn gestern nicht probiert.
Ich hat zu viel betraut. Im Meister hat ich mich geirrt.
Es tut mir leid, zeig her, mein Kind, dass ich dir helfe, gleich geschwind.
So weit verstehe, wie es geht, doch wie ich gehe, zwingt mich zu stehen.
That was Victoria de Los Angeles as Eva, with the greatest of the post-World War II interpreters of Hans Sachs, Paul Schöffler, in the Metropolitan Opera performance of the 10th of January 1953, conducted by Fritz Reiner. And speaking of triangular relationships, it is not for nothing that in describing the correlation within a master song to Walter, Sachs uses the metaphor of reproductive biology to describe the two strophes, the Stollen, as the equivalent of man and wife, and the aftersong, Abgesang, representing their offspring, resembling the strophes to a point, but developing in new, independent ways. At the point the dream does become reality for the younger Richard Wagner in his guise as Walter von Stolzing, for Richard Wagner, the wise old wanderer that is Hans Sachs, it is the end of a dream that once may have captivated, possibly tempted him. But now, unlike with Mathilde Wesendonck and the other women with whom he is known to have had dalliances in earlier days, this Wagner gives his Sachs the strength of will to do the right thing, even though in real life Hans Sachs did get remarried to a younger widow. The master dramatist, Richard Wagner, for theatrical reasons, has his fictional Sachs surrender any claim to his dream Evchen, even when she offers herself to him in gratitude with an outburst now worthy of an incipient Isolde. That was Joan Sutherland singing in English with Raphael Kubelik conducting the Covent Garden Orchestra in a concert on the 5th of May, 1957. As Wagner delved deeper into this work and further from the frenzy of Tristan, he was aging through his 50s, from middle age into what was then considered seniority, even though he was to sire a son the year after the Meistersinger premiere. As he rewrote the libretto, the poem as he would call it, he could no longer see himself as the young Walter pushing to enter an entrenched musical world, but recognized that he was now part of a new musical establishment. Hans Sachs Wagner. In a final moment of self-delusion, Sachs does openly admit to Eva that he would indeed seriously consider her proposition. Child, I have thought it over. It will be best if I woo you after all. There I might still win something for myself as a poet. Say something. It was your idea, wasn't it? But he is too late. Eva is filled with the sight of the resplendent young aristocrat knight dressed for the singing contest, envisaging his muse and the culmination of his hymn of praise for her. Sachs is fully aware that time has passed and that he has to move on as well, and cannot take the disastrous path of a December-May relationship, but the higher path of, say, Wotan as the wanderer relinquishing a beloved child to the upstart Siegfried, a scene that was already developing musically in the composer's mind. As if to underline the point, Wagner here takes us firmly back into the music of the future to show that he has learned from the past about preventing an impossible future with a deliberate quotation that implies he is ready to learn from past history. For the character, from literature, from the composer, from his music. My child, of Tristan and Isolde, a grievous tale I know. Hans Sachs was wise and would not endure King Mark's woe. The self-awareness and honesty of Sachs in his next line provides both the emotional punch of the opera and highlights the development of the story from Wagner's original 1845 scenario. 'Twas time I found the right man to wed you, or else I too would have lost my head. That was Ara Barbarian singing in English, conducted by Julius Rudel at the New York City Opera on the 7th of March, 1976. That's the fictional account. Of course, real life does not necessarily mirror art, and occasionally all can be winners. In the opera, Walter Wagner gets the girl. In biographical history, the year after the birth of his son in 1870, the 57-year-old Richard Wagner wed the 33-year-old Cosima Barbara Liszt von Bülow. Meanwhile, his present alter ego, Hans Sachs, is not quite so lucky and covers his embarrassment at the earlier decision to accept Eva and his now obvious misguided love in expressing anger at the world in general and railing at the hard life of a cobbler with a soul, pun intended. A cobbler is expected to know everything, and if he's also a poet, they won't leave that side of him in peace either. And if he's a widower, they certainly make sport with him. The youngest girls, when there's a shortage of men, want him to ask for their hand, whether he understands them or not, no matter whether his answer is yes or no. And I am again quoting from the libretto. Moments later, to the sublime music of the famous quintet, it is Sachs who experiences the most fundamental soul-searching realization. In front of this beautiful child, I would willingly let my heart sing, but the heart's sweet burden had to be subdued. It was a beautiful morning dream. After his dark night of the soul, pun certainly not intended, Sachs is now ready to face the day, his fellow masters, and the folk of Nuremberg. With the new day, the music of the future has arrived, a blend of what was old yet meaningful, tempered with what is new yet inspired, and the dreams of youthful love. But his hometown has a surprise in store. Love is not only individual, intimate, mysterious, but the staid old city, which in his earlier Van monologue, Sachs had gently mocked with affection and a great tune, how peacefully with its faithful customs, contented in deed and work lies my dear Nuremberg, now shows its respect for a leading citizen with his own poem about Martin Luther heard earlier. To this, Sachs bashfully responds, "You take this lightly, but for me you make it hard. You do me too much honor," before suggesting to the assembly the possible outcome of the competition. "Consider the contest's rare prize, and whoever shall succeed, let him be pure and noble in wooing as in singing." He is obviously not referring to the town clerk, whose muddling of the words of Walter's poem, written in Sachs's hand, need not detain us. It is the stuff of commedia dell'arte misrepresentation, although very clever. The challenge for the composer is that Walter must sing a master song that sounds spontaneous, correctly fulfills all the rules of the tabulatur, pleases the assembled townsfolk, and be good enough to win the competition and the prize, whilst it must seem natural and appropriate to the character. If Wagner, the composer, has a solution to his problem of repetition, Wagner, the dramatist, still has a practical difficulty. Sachs has handed the text of the song, mutilated by Beckmesser, to Kortner to follow, and so he would be aware of the slightest change which would immediately disqualify the singer. This difficulty is averted by an unusually specific stage direction. Quote, "Kortner is so moved that he drops a sheet which he had started reading. He and the other masters listen with increasing attention. Walter noted it without seeming to, and now proceeds with a freer style. Oh, the importance of that look. It leads to inspiration and improvisation. Walter now takes the old rules and develops them linguistically and melodically. After the first 4 lines of the first stanza, the sung melody evolves into a different direction. The meter, the lyrics, and the rhyming change, and the orchestral accompaniment becomes very quiet, allowing the vocal line to soar above it. What is interesting is that even though each stanza is now longer, the effect upon the listener is of compression. In the first stanza, Walter sings of the Garden of Eden, with Eve in his arms, paradise. After a brief interjection from Sachs in the chorus with a modulation to the somewhat strange key of B major, which is so subtle that the listener is almost unaware, and by the end of the stanza reverts to C major as Walter sings of the mountain he must climb to reach the muse of Parnassus. The Abgesang, the aftersong, brings together inspiration and regulation, artist and artisan, aristocrat and burgher, bride and muse in a long, slow crescendo similar to the Tristan Act II Liebesnacht duet. But the reality of Nuremberg's day is a happier place. The revelations of the Midsummer Night's Dreams bearing fruit, the garden paradise revealing an earthly muse of Parnassus, for whom Walter must give his all. This time, the transition from the poetic dreams of night to the rational light of day does not end harshly, but with victory. Wagner originally planned to end the opera at this point, as the dramatic and musical strands are tied up. But because the character of Hans Sachs had become the heart of the work, he felt the final focus needed to be with him. To achieve this, he gave an unforeseen but completely honest edge to Walter's victory, when he makes it quite clear on being offered guild membership that he did all this only to get the girl. Having been rejected earlier as a singer, the angry, aloof aristocrat rejects the art. On some unabashed level, his response, "Nicht Meister nein, will ohne Meister selig sein," is snobbery at its most blatant, to the point of rudeness. I will be happy without a master's degree. Much ink has been spilt on Sachs's response to this, with the seemingly jingoistic speech, "Disdain not the masters, but honor their art. Verachtet mir die Meister nicht und ehrt mit ihrer Kunst." It is true that nationalism is certainly present, but as the eminent German stage director Götz Friedrich said about this, his favorite Wagner opera, which he directed many times, this speech was premiered in 1868, 2.5 years before the unification of Germany in 1871. Therefore, Sax's words meant something different for the composer and his audience than they do for us. The music certainly, but even the words, are quite objective compared with the use to which they were later put, not least because of the composer's own writings. But it was Cosima who made Richard Wagner compose the passage at the time, possibly to please the Prussian pro-imperial powers and obtain much needed funding. And it is known that Wagner did, in fact, attempt to cut it, but she insisted he put it back in. This he did, and he conducted it in performance, so must have believed its dramaturgical and musical necessity. If you look at a modern translation, such as this by a former Met colleague, another whose favorite opera this is, you may understand just what is in the mind of Hans Sachs, former cobbler to the Emperor Maximilian I. A call for unity that is as much artistic as political and universal rather than for the Holy Roman Empire, the world of Hans Sachs at that time. How can an artistic tradition be regarded as worthless when it can offer such a valuable prize? These masters have nurtured art according to their own vision. Though no longer the province of the elite reserved for castles and princes, in the stress of bad times, art has remained the voice of truth. And so, as Sachs convinces von Stolzing to become a part of the musical establishment that by 1868 included Richard Wagner, in the words of Warren Darcy at Oberlin College, all is absorbed into the massive, undifferentiated C major sonority, the social stability represented by the final strains of C major comes at the price of loss of individuality. Die Meistersinger is very far removed from the theoretical music drama proposed by Wagner in his essay, Opera and Drama. In many ways, it is still closer to Singspiel than to Die Walküre, except the Spiel is sung out across one of the largest orchestrations in the current repertoire. Die Meistersinger requires 81 orchestra players, including a double wind band, though Tristan requires triple winds, and the Ring needs double the double winds of the comedy. In a larger house, such as the Metropolitan Opera, Beaumarchais' Figaro comic operas by Mozart and Rossini require only 52 players each total. In 1868, the opera was, and still is, not easy to play and sing, for all of Wagner's writing on the simplicity of the work, given the difficulty of the vocal and orchestral parts. Although Tristan and Isolde pushes chromaticism to its limits, Die Meistersinger is proudly diatonic, even to the point of starting and ending in the key of C major, with a classical tonal system throughout. The relationship of various keys is important, as it is through seeming extemporaneous key changes that Wagner signifies the inspiration of Walter and his distancing from tradition. There are unexpected modulations, the use of secondary triads giving an archaic modal feel. The music looks backwards and forwards at the same time. The rehearsal period for the first production had been particularly fraught, being long and arduous, with the orchestra caught between the difficult personality and the sharp tongue of the conductor, Hans von Bülow, which alienated many of the musicians with whom he worked. Although Wagner himself, who was present much of the time and frequently interrupted the proceedings, called von Bülow's conducting a grand festivity never to be experienced again. Following one particularly difficult 5-hour rehearsal, the orchestra went on strike, led by its principal horn player, who disliked Richard Wagner. He said that they were unable to play any further that day, and he wanted to get home to play a little music with his 4-year-old son. The horn player was Franz Strauss, and that 4-year-old, also called Richard, was to become Wagner's operatic heir. At the final dress rehearsal of Die Meistersinger on the 19th of June, 1868, Wagner admitted to the assembled company that this was, quote, an exceedingly complex work. And in a quiet, heartfelt speech, he went on, the creation of a truly German musical dramatic art, and above all, the most perfect production possible of it, can be achieved only by the whole of the forces concerned being animated by a common conception. In other words, he recognized that this production was a theatrical and musical sea change. I suspect that the work was then and is now a success because the audience recognized that Wagner's first attempt at a grand opera since Rienzi is indeed full of traditional set pieces, arias, ensembles, choruses, preludes, marches, and dances, many of the stereotypical operatic conventions, which make it far from the theoretical principles of opera and drama. Yet they service the plot without seeming a regression to grand opera pomposity. Each of the major soloists have their solo moments. Some have several, and all three acts end with an ensemble worthy of the grandest of Italian and Russian operas. This opera is about music. It is poetry, and it is theatre, with all that implies on stage and off. The epic composition of June 1868 is far beyond Wagner's dream. Whilst taking the waters of Marienbad in July 1845, its structure is, indeed, counter-revolutionary. The content is revolutionary. What he has given us is very much einen wunderschöner Traum, that owes more to the theatricality and music of Tristan than the Lortzing-like cash cow he envisaged as a fast, cheap, light, short, immediate successor to Tannhäuser. At first, Wagner, despite its length, complexity, and sheer numbers of artists involved, refused to allow the work to be performed with cuts to make it more accessible, although he was often asked. He felt that the theatres should change their work rules to make it work as he created it. But he finally gave way to allow the publisher to make money. Note, he did it for the publisher, not himself, he said. But we're no longer talking of a dream, but of reality. With Die Meistersinger completed and performed, Wagner now had other mountains to climb along with his Siegfried, through the cleansing fires of maturity to the heights of ecstasy with his beloved bride Brunhilde. Or should that be Cosima? As with Sachs, crowned at the opera's closed in the laurel wreath, Richard, through Walter von Stolzing, jubilantly hymns his dream in its entirety. from Act 3 of the dress rehearsal of the then new production of Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg at the Metropolitan Opera on the 11th of January 1993. That was Francisco Reitzer as Walter von Stolzing, with Donald McIntyre seen briefly as Hans Sachs and Carita Mattila as Eva, with the Metropolitan Opera chorus and orchestra conducted by James Levine. I was the stage manager, and in 50 years of singing Die Meistersinger performances around the world, I have to say that I have never seen a Walter von Stolzing like a Reitzer at that point. We were all in tears in the wings. It was one of the most amazing things that I've ever experienced. Anyway, on the 9th of October, 1867, the 55-year-old Franz Liszt visited Wagner, then aged 54, at Tribschen. There, the two men, close friends who had not seen each other in 3 years, spent 6 hours discussing Wagner's affair with Liszt's daughter Cosima, still at that time married to his former student Hans von Bülow, who had conducted the premiere of Tristan in 1865 and was to conduct the premiere of Die Meistersinger the following year. That was the hors d'oeuvre. The main course for the evening followed, when they were joined by other guests, and Liszt, sight reading from a manuscript full score, played long sections of Die Meistersinger with Wagner singing all of the roles. The event was described 2 decades later by the journalist Richard Pohl, who was present. I never heard a finer performance of Meistersinger. Such ravishing truth of expression, such beauty of phrasing, such clarity in every detail. To his friend, King Ludwig, Wagner described the Abbé Liszt as a dear, great, unique creature. To his friend, Princess Wittgenstein, Liszt wrote that while Wagner had changed, his face was pinched and lined, his genius was as powerful as ever. No one but he could have produced such a masterpiece. I was amazed by the incomparable sap, audacity, vigor, abundance, verve, and absolute control of Die Meistersinger, where the revolution in music drama became, quite simply, evolution. Liszt's piano transcription of the finale of Die Meistersinger, played by Abdiel Vasquez. The picture by George Paparitz of Richard Wagner at Bayreuth, with Franz Liszt playing the piano.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was, there we are. That was really wonderful. I learned so much, and I can tell from the comments that people really enjoyed it as well. We did have a few questions, many of which you, or at least some of which at least you answered through the course of the lecture. I would first of all be remiss. I don't know if I didn't notice if Kirk is still on. But I had avocado smoothie envy, having lived in Long Beach for 21 years. And I saw that he was enjoying an avocado smoothie. In any case, one question we had here was, would you share your opinions about some recent productions of the opera?
No.
No? Okay.
For the simple reason I don't go to the opera.
Very good. All right.
Tiring, keep opera at bay.
Okay. There's another one about various styles of conducting Meistersinger. Do you have any favorites?
You know what, I'm not sure I actually want to answer the question, simply because I have to admit at this point that the Meistersinger is my least favorite of the Wagner operas. It's not one that I have gone out of my way to see. And the other problem I have with it is that I grew up in London in the 1960s and early 70s. And so I learned the opera from Reginald Goodall, which was such a unique interpretation, not least because it was in English. And unfortunately, we couldn't play the extracts that we had of his performance. But in many ways, it colored everything I have heard since.
Well, I really appreciated the diversity of excerpts that you provided, and the historical background was really fascinating. I'm wondering if there are any other questions?
Put it this way, the talk was longer than the third act of Meistersinger, so I suspect everybody is either running to the bathroom or to the bar.
Well, I just absolutely, I adore the opera. I still adore it. It's not my favorite either, but it is so rich and so it's so beautiful. And I think your take on it as being both essentially retro, but also revolutionary is very interesting. The music is very much about innovation, I think, and even though we don't think of it that way in the context of some of the other things that Wagner was working on at that time.
What I find actually most amazing about it, and I really think I might take a much closer look at it, is the fact that he was juggling so many different works at the same time, writing the poem, as he would call them, the libretto of one, while working on the scenario of another, while composing the music for two others, all in the same time period. And that I find astounding.
Yeah. Yeah, and we think of him as having taken a quarter of a century to write The Ring, but he was working on so many different things at the same time,
written works as well, because I mean, the written works, I mean, that's a huge amount of work as well.
Yes, yeah, the prose, yes. Well, wonderful. Listen, I won't keep everyone because it is not quite, well, we're a little bit beyond Act 3, right? But
we're coming up to Rheingold length.
Yes, right, exactly. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephen. And this has been such a pleasure. And we look forward to having you return next year, hopefully.
Okay. Well, I find myself wondering whether, in fact, I did so much research into this because I was trying to learn the piece to like the piece. Whereas I wonder whether I might do quite so much work with an opera that I love.
Yeah, okay. Well, I know you put a lot of work into it, as did Jim, our man behind the curtain, which I greatly appreciate very, very much.
I would like to have a shout out for Jim Richardson. It would not have been as good as it was without him.
Yes, thank you, Jim. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend and a great Thanksgiving, and we'll see you all next year. Take care.
All too soon.
Take care. Bye.
Okay, good night.
Good night.